Right, so our next speaker is the CEO and founder of Living Systems, a company that specializes in leadership and group and organizational transformation. In addition to 15 years experience as a leadership consultant, he spent 6 years as a manager at Mars Confectionery and 5 years as a senior brand strategist at Future Brand. Here to talk about leading in today's disruptive environment is Ian Byrne. Please make him welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and nice to be here. As was said in the introduction, we founded Living Systems really to help our clients adapt to disruption. And we've been working in the areas of organizational development, team development, and leadership development over the last 15 years. And what we want to talk about today is what we're going to talk about called balancing direction with connection, which we feel is the fundamental skill that's needed for leaders in the new world. But let's begin. If we can start on the next slide, please. So it would be really easy to start and to focus straight in on COVID-19 and the changes it's forced all of us to make to our working, whether it's like for the bulk of us working remotely, or even those people who are still forced to work on site. We've had to almost overnight adapt our ways of working and transform our business models to really meet the new environment. And it's no surprise, therefore, that many of us find ourselves with an increased workload and with fewer resources. Most of the organizations we're speaking to have implemented headcounts, and the amount of work has gone up, not gone down. Indeed, a recent report by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has found that the average working day has gone up in the last year from 10 to 11 hours. So we're working harder with less resources and more work on our plates. And for many of us, as I've said before, we're doing this in a very isolated manner. So we're being forced to work from home with what's called virtual distance. A new survey recently found from UCL found that 1 in 3 people is currently suffering from loneliness at the moment. So it's a big issue. And in addition to that, there's a whole load of new challenges around collaboration and group dynamics. We all know the issue of people interrupting each other on Zoom, but the problem actually affects productivity as well. So a recent study, I think it's out this month in Harvard Business Review, talks about innovation falling by over 90%, trust declining by over 80%. All of these figures coming when virtual distance, in other words, the distance that occurs through being separated by screens, is not managed properly. So clearly, COVID and what's happened is an incredibly important part that is putting employee well-being in the spotlight this year. But to focus solely here would be to ignore the broader context within which this is happening as well. So can we have the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Thanks. So I think it's important at this point to recognize that COVID hasn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't that there was no change going on and then COVID hit last year. COVID, we believe at Living Systems, has simply served to amplify and accelerate a process of change that has been going on for a lot longer than that. So for at least the last 5 to 10 years now, it's seen that there's been a number of changes underway at the global level that really suggest we're going through some bigger process of change. You only have to look at the rise of populisms and populist leaders across Europe and in the States, and the increasing polarization of debate that's happening both in the political sphere, on social media. We seem to be retreating and factionalizing more than ever before rather than coming closer together. Increasingly, we've got increasing economic uncertainty. So output last year was down 7% and significantly more to follow, as Kerry Cooper just said in his presentation. And then on top of that, there's a looming climate crisis just around the corner, which threatens to dwarf everything else in terms of the scale of the kind of issues that we're facing. So it's no surprise then, first of all, the point I want to make here is it's no surprise then to find that these issues are actually worrying on the minds of employees, as well as how they adapt to working from home and working remotely. Again, a recent survey from the OECD found that the economy is now a significant source of stress for over 70% of Americans, politics for about 69%, and we're increasingly seeing issues around depression and anxiety coming up around worries about the environment as well. So as we're all retreating and being forced to retreat back into our houses and work from a more virtually distanced manner, at the macro level, as well as at the micro level, we're facing issues that are creating deep uncertainty. But the other point I wanted to make around this socio-political turmoil, if we go to the next slide. Thank you. is that it would also be a mistake to assume that things are going to go back to normal after the pandemic. In fact, we think change is going to accelerate further, and that this has really served just to compound some trends that are already underway in the world. Indeed, as Zanny Minton-Beddoes, who's the editor-in-chief of The Economist, said in December, the disruption is still in its infancy. So it would be a mistake to think we're going to go back. And the change that we're going to see as we see over the next few years is going to get faster, not get slower. And the organizations that recognize this, obviously there are opportunities to be had there, but clearly there are a number of threats to both personal and organizational well-being that we want to talk about in the next few slides. So we need to recognize this is part of a broader change that's happening, and the foot isn't going to come off the gas once we get through COVID. And as we're all locked down through isolation in this, we're all currently alone in this together. So next slide, please. So why is well-being important in this environment? Well, first of all, and I think it probably doesn't need saying too much, but psychological health is most at risk during periods of significant disruption like we're going through. Even coming into the pandemic last year, that's before the pandemic even hit, 1/3 of Americans had displayed clinical signs of anxiety, depression, or even both, and that's before the pandemic began. So psychological health of individuals is at risk during periods of disruption. But the other point we wanted to make as well is that organizational well-being becomes more important as well. And why is that? Well, that's because there's a tendency for organizations to pull apart during times of difficulty, stress, or significant disruption. So a lot of our work when we come into organizations is actually picking up the issues that are not being discussed within leadership teams, not being discussed within functions. And that lack of connectivity within the organizations create issues around organizational well-being as employee well-being, and it actually affects the organization's ability to adapt. So you can see here that not only does well-being become important, but actually underlying both individual and organizational well-being is this idea of psychological safety and connectivity. In other words, do I feel safe to talk about issues that may be difficult, that may be raise concerns, that may sound stupid, that may challenge my other people's viewpoints? Do I feel that there is that space between us to be able to do that? And that's important both to employee health and employee well-being, but it's also important to organizational well-being. Next slide, please. So what are the clients that we're talking to doing at a process level to embed well-being in the organization? And I'm sure you're going to hear a lot of these things throughout the next few presentations, but the clear thing that every client we're speaking to doing is prioritizing leadership communication. So just chatting to a leader at Verizon recently, and I think they've moved from a quarterly all hands to a weekly or every 2 week all hands from senior leadership. And many of the organizations we are speaking to are really making sure that senior leaders are getting out there as often as possible. But not just that, they're also making sure that they are making the tone of communication very human. So those senior leaders are really being briefed with to be open and to be vulnerable about their own challenges with lockdown, so that they're actually making it more allowable to talk around issues around mental health and wellness. In fact, one CFO just did an all hands to, I think it's 15,000 people, but insisted that they were folding their laundry as they did it, really to try to bring in the humanity that we're all struggling with this together. And it's not something that the leaders at the top think they've got fixed as well. And that's really important. The second area that we're seeing a lot of people, a lot of organizations respond is probably one of the most important, which is creating opportunities for informal networking. So that's really, first of all, about doing the basics. I think in Carrie's presentation, he was talking about the importance of regular one-on-ones. We would absolutely second that. And we would also say that, you know, the regular one-on-ones you're doing and the regular team sessions, they should be some sessions dedicated just to the people and not the business. So the people in their lives and what's going on. Because it's really important to understand that at the moment, that source of connection that we had around the coffee machine, that source of connection that we had, we could go to lunch with people, is no longer there. And there is a danger of people's well-being suffering if all we're doing is meeting online to talk about work. And there's no human connection there. Again, it's going to decrease that connectivity that we've said is so important. Thirdly, a wide raft of information and education being made available by clients on well-being. So PwC have done a huge amount in terms of videos, online training around nutrition, exercise workout sessions. And clearly, if your organization has the resources to do that, this is really important, even down to how actually to make virtual meetings more productive and look after well-being when working from home. Adequate support processes. Again, a number of big organizations such as Bristol Myers Squibb are doing 24/7 employee support lines where they can actually reach a dedicated professional as and when they need one. And then, of course, underpinning all of this is the need to leverage organizational analytics to really be able to get a read on well-being issues before they actually surface and occur as a big problem in the organization. It's for that reason that we actually announced a partnership with Temporal, a data analytics firm, this year, as we've seen our industry, organizational development, really needing to move more firmly in that area, particularly in the area of well-being. So there's a whole host of things that I can talk about there, and that we can mention that our clients doing around embedding processes and structures within the organization. But I guess our key message that we would want to take away from the presentation is this. Can we go to the next slide, please? If what you're doing is focusing on business processes and systems without addressing the capability of your leadership and management, it's like you're painting lipstick on a gorilla. You can implement any kind of change that you want, and underneath it, it's still a gorilla. It's not going to change. And why do we say that? We say that because we believe that leadership and management capability is the fundamental driver of employee well-being, is the quality of your leaders and your managers and their ability to support that. Why is that? Can we go to the next slide, please? So first at this point, I want to say this is not just an issue around employee well-being as a tactical measure in terms of just measuring employee well-being or looking just on that basis. Just fundamentally, the role of leadership and management is changing in organizations. I've said that the world is already changing. We're moving into a new environment, which is characterized by continuous volatility, complexity, and uncertainty. It's going to get more volatile, more complex, and more uncertain as we move into this millennium. And that fundamentally changes the roles of leadership and management. And it changes it in a number of different ways. So first of all, they need to be able to manage polarities in their leadership. This is not just changing your leadership style, it's changing actually your leadership and how you lead depending upon the situation you find. So to give you an example, as a leader, when do I need to be decisive and make decisions? When do I need to involve and to co-create with others? When do I need to communicate certainty and provide confidence to my people? When do I need to admit I don't know? So in many different facets of leadership, whereas previously you could take one approach, now actually depending upon the situation you're finding, leaders need to have a much broader range of style and a much broader range of their leadership. And actually what they need to do is to all of a sudden start to learn how to work productively with anxiety. Typically the role of the manager in the past was to contain anxiety, to get it off the table, to get rid of it so we could actually focus on the rational task at hand. Well, that kind of approach is no longer going to work when you're dealing in an environment where we've got a pandemic coming, we've got a pandemic here, we've got a global recession coming, we've got all sorts of stuff happening on the world. It's simply not realistic to try to push it off the table. So what leaders need to do now is to be much more skillful at being able to work productively with that anxiety and actually turn it into and to transform it into a force for good. And as you can see, it's coming back to the whole thrust of many of our presentation. Underlying all of these skills is this ability to foster open connection, for a manager and a leader to foster open connection with all of their relationships, both up the organization, across and down. And that relies on their ability to establish psychological safety. So can we go to the next slide, please? So let's just take a minute to think about what happens when this goes wrong and when it goes right. And remember, of course, that only 50% of people, according to a latest survey, actually feel comfortable reaching out for help. But what happens when we get it wrong? Well, let's remember again that for some people, work and particularly their relationship with their manager may be some of the only social outlets that some people have at the moment. And that let's also remember that the situation is very different for people depending upon their living circumstances. So the likelihood is if you're 16 to 34, you're more likely to be suffering from mental health issues. You're probably working in a small flat that's more crowded, where working is more difficult. And let's imagine that, for example, you're like one of the clients I was speaking to, one of my clients. She was based in Paris. And now, I don't know if many of you know, but in the lockdown in Paris, you were only allowed to exercise or to walk 1 kilometer from where you live. Now, it so happened in the center of Paris where she lived, the 1 kilometer around her flat was actually all concrete jungle. So by the time we'd spoken, by the time we got to speak about 4 weeks into lockdown, she hadn't she hadn't touched another human being or even seen a tree in 4 to 5 weeks, and she was quite desperate. Or you may be a young family or young head of a family, living in a small flat that's crowded, that's noisy, maybe your relationship's falling apart with your partner. Again, in both these environments, very often it's the manager is one of the few places that these people have to reach out for help. And what happens, of course, is if we get it wrong, there's a potential for real collapse and for real potential psychological issues to become much worse. Because actually, I feel suddenly more isolated by the fact that I've tried to reach out to my manager and it hasn't helped. You know, and if we're looking at the negative psychological effects of lockdown and COVID, you know, there's all sorts of things ranging from post-traumatic stress, emotional disturbance, depression, low mood, irritability, insomnia, anger, and so on. I could go on. So the manager's role is fundamentally important to the employee's psychological well-being. You know, let's put aside the work numbers for a start anyway. So what happens when you get it right? Well, at this point, I want to talk about an example from my background when I was working at Mars. My home function, if you like, was marketing, and they actually decided to send me into manufacturing for a year. And it so happened they gave me one of the biggest manufacturing lines to run as a young man, which is a great pride. But after about 3 weeks, I managed to blow up the microwave, which was one of the biggest, it was the biggest microwave in Europe, and I managed to set fire to it. The production of the chocolate brand I was running went down for about a week and a half, and supply was interrupted across all of the UK and across all of Europe as a result of the mistake I'd made. Now, if you can imagine the state that I was in when I had to come into work the next day, I actually remember that my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, had to kick me out of bed because I was almost crying. I was so ashamed about what I'd done and felt so fearful about what the business were going to say when I walked in that day. When I walked in, I was immediately called in to go and see the head of manufacturing. His name was Steve, and he had a fearsome reputation. And I'm honest, I was fairly scared of him as well. But I'll never forget what happened that day. He called me into his office and he said to me, "Ian, how are you doing?" And of course, my natural response to that point was to do what most people do when they're feeling ashamed or embarrassed. I said, "Fine." We say that stands for feelings inside not expressed as facilitators. So I didn't express what I was feeling. But Steve didn't leave it there. He looked at me again. He pulled a little closer and said, "Ian, how are you doing?" By this time, I'm starting to wobble again. "Fine." But it was only the third time when he actually came right up to my chair, put his hand on my knee, looked into my face and said very gently, "Ian, how are you doing?" That I actually poured out, this emotion poured out. I've been holding back and wanting to keep hidden from him. And the important thing to understand here is this didn't just address my issue. It didn't just put me right in terms of managing my emotion. He helped normalize it by telling me that he'd done a similar thing at my age and swore me to secrecy on it. But the important thing is it transformed the relationship and the trust between myself and that manager. And actually what enabled us to go on to do was to implement a whole series of processing changes in how we ran the factory, because I felt able to ask silly questions of him. I felt able to ask for support where I was needed to, and it actually improved our working relationship and engendered new results. So the stakes here are really high, because if you get it wrong, then there's a potential for psychological collapse and real psychological damage when people don't get the support they need. But if you get it right, you build trust and connection within a relationship, and you end up creating safe psychological spaces where people can thrive, be human, and maintain their creativity and effectiveness. So if we can go to the next slide, please. What does this mean for my leaders? Well, it requires a step change in capability. You know, it's not just about intellectual horsepower anymore, it's also about self-awareness and emotional intelligence more than ever before. I said it before, it needs adaptivity in terms of adaptability in terms of leadership style, comfort, working with volatility, complexity, and this ability to recognize and deal with potentially strong emotions in both themselves and their others. And regardless of all of this, what underpins all of it is this need to build strong relationships characterized by openness, neutrality, and trust. Now, the point I want to make here is that none of these are new. It's not as if we're saying, wow, you need these skills, you never needed them before. These skills have always been important in business, but the point we want to make is that as of this year, the last few years, they're becoming absolutely essential. And without them, it's just not possible to be successful. Let me go to the next slide, please. So if you like, that's really the theme of this presentation, is that what got us here won't get us there. The environment that we're in, we really need to learn to balance direction with connection. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, but in essence, one of the things that Carrie Cooper said in an interview, actually, I think before coming to the conference, I was watching an interview where he was asked a really good question. He was asked, Are you worried in the virtual environment about toxic managers, potential managers who might scream at people, bully people, being unsupervised, and those situations deteriorating more at work? Well, and his response was a great response. He said he's less worried about those than he is about the managers who think they're doing a good job, but not really paying attention to connection, emotional well-being, who may even be blind to emotions and relationships because they're so focused on the business. And I think our observation would be that as a culture and as a business culture in the West, what we've done over the last 30 to 50 years is we've tried to rule emotions and relationships out of the workplace. And the danger here is that we've created and accept far too many managers who don't have this capability to balance direction with connection within our workplace. And it's those leaders actually who are going to struggle in the new environment. So next slide, please. Questions you may be asking yourself, or your people might be asking of your people, is how to develop self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and empathy. It's not the same as teaching a skill, and we'll come into that in a minute. How can you learn to navigate volatility, complexity, uncertainty? Again, it's not as if there's a set of skills that you can just go and read an article and then you know how to do it. There's no set process. Or why is it that my investment in leadership development isn't turning into results? Again, these are questions that we hear leaders ask all the time. And typically what we hear them say is, look, I've invested in leadership development, but it's not translating into action. Somehow our people are told they know what they need to do, but we're not seeing that manifest either in leadership behavior, in the self-awareness that they display around their actions, and even into business results. And why is that? So if we can just go to the next slide, please. So for the last 15 years, we've been working in this area of really helping build managers and leaders that are equipped for increasing volatility, complexity, and uncertainty. And in fact, a lot of the work we did in the early years was with technology organizations, software organizations like Microsoft and Skype and so on. And what we found was that these organizations have been struggling with issues around volatility and complexity and even remote working a lot longer than most of us have. And one of the things that we learned very much from working with Microsoft and really helping them to tackle this issue about manager capability and manager excellence, actually, how do you create a population of managers who are not only intellectually bright and have a technical task for the skill, how do you really get them to care about people, to really have a passion for getting things done through people? Microsoft at the time was an organization that had scaled rapidly and had promoted a lot of individual contributors into the first manager role. And what they found was that although they were trying to equip them with the skills, teach them situational leadership, sending them on coaching programs, it still wasn't translating into either employee satisfaction scores or actually into business results in terms of how they're managing. And over the years, what we've found is a number of things that we'd like to share with you about really how do you embed a culture, how do you create a culture of management excellence and leadership excellence in your business? And again, the first message here would be, if you're not making management development a priority right now, you really should be. It is the key determinant, I said, not just of employee well-being, but also of adaptability for organizations as we move forward. So what we found is really that if you want to develop these kind of mindsets and attitudes and really help people evoke the shift really into what's required to people management, or even actually the shift into senior leadership, traditional approaches of development are not enough on their own. So typically when we think about development, we think about giving people knowledge, tools, skills, a framework. Many of you may have been through the framework situational leadership, which is a great tool for thinking about how you manage and coach your direct reports. And similarly, we often think about development as happening in a classroom. If people need developing, let's send them on a program. It's almost a bit like we talk about it as a sheep dip, or the idea that you're opening people's heads, putting some new tools and frameworks inside in a classroom, and then they're coming out ready to go. And that's typically, and it's all too often how we think about development in today's environment. And whilst those things are important, if you want to develop really great people management skills, the ability to foster open connection, this self-awareness and empathy that we've been talking about, you need something else. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. What you need to do is to support work with knowledge and tools and skills with work on mindset change. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And actually, classroom-based learning needs to be backed up by experiential learning in the workplace. And it's only when you put all of this together that you can start to create the environment where people start to go through the kind of shifts that are needed to really become excellent people managers and excellent people leaders. So can we go to the next slide, please? So the way we learned this, as we said, was many years ago with Microsoft working and designing their global management development program. And what we found was that people had been given a huge amount of tools and skills. As I was saying, situational leadership skills, the GROW coaching model, how to give feedback, all these kind of tools that would actually equip them to do the job. And the assumption of senior leadership was that that would be enough to take them from being individual contributors into being effective people managers. But of course, what it didn't shift was the bigger thing that's sitting underneath, which is the mindset. It's the attitudes. How do you support an individual to go from a primary value of getting stuff done myself, being the expert, being the one who fixes the problems, to actually really value getting stuff done through others? In other words, I don't want to fix the problem. I actually want to get to a place of supporting Jenny or Mike, whoever it might be, to be able to solve the problem for themselves, because that's not something you can train through skills and tools. That's about a shift of mindset. So how do you do that through development programs has really been a big passion of ours over the last 12 years. And if we go to the next slide, please. The thing that we would like to summarize really is the key takeaway. I mean, none of this is rocket science, but we think it's really, this has always been important. As we said, it's more important now than ever before. The first is to really look at extending development out of the classroom. So if you look at the experiential learning cycle on the bottom left, I'll just describe that. Many of you may be familiar with this, but it's really a circle of how we learn through experience. So if you imagine that the experience side, I tried to get on a bike to ride a bike for the first time. I fall off and I sit on the pavement, scratching my head and wondering what went on. So I start to reflect on my experience. Then from there, I come up with a theory, which is, okay, I was turning the handlebars too hard and it was steering the bike too hard. So I'm conceptualizing how to ride a bike is different from how I've seen it before, which is the theory side. And then I experiment or design experiments and plan what I'm going to do next time differently. Okay, so when I get on the bike, I'm not going to steer as wildly as before. I'm going to try and keep things in control. And that really is how we actually learn from our experience and how we learn in everyday life. The problem is when we just see learning as happening in the classroom, we really just give people a chance to work predominantly around this conceptualization phase. So what happened is we give them a concept, we give them a tool, we might in the workshop get them to think about how they want to experiment with it when they're outside of the office, or when they're outside the classroom, sorry. But then we never close that loop for them to reflect on their learning and their experience and to gain feedback on actually how they did it. And that's really critical to developing self-awareness. And it's really only by extending development out of the classroom, you really are able to focus on all 4 stages of the experiential learning cycle. So what does this look like in practice? It really looks like creating a learning culture across your business. So seeing that development happens in the workplace as well as in the classroom. And it's really supported by things like on-the-job learning, expert one-to-one coaching, even small group coaching. So working in small peer coaching groups over a period of time to raise each other's awareness and provide feedback to each other. Executive mentoring, action learning, which is a process for actually working on real problems whilst also developing and learning, and peer feedback. So again, the invitation would be is if these aren't things you're familiar with or they're not things that you're embedding within your organization, we would really suggest and encourage you that these are the sort of things that you should be looking at extending into, because it's the organizations that are capable to continuously learn and adapt from their experience as they're implementing that actually are the most able to adapt to disruption. So again, organizational well-being actually extends even just beyond the employee side to actually focus on building this as a core capability. So if we can just come to the next slide, please. So just wrapping up slightly. So if you're sitting there saying, what can I do next? Just a few takeaways that we would suggest. So the first is spend time with your people on their lives, not just the business, as we've said before. Make some time and make business conversation unallowable during those times. It's all about getting to know each other as people. We have to be much more conscious and overt about trying to create these opportunities now that the coffee machine and that wait by the lift or even the lunch hall is not available to us. Secondly, invest in yourself. Start with yourself. Invest in yourself, your self-awareness, your impact on others and what makes you tick. One of the things that often makes employee wellbeing programs, management development programs lacking credibility is they're not role modeled from the top. And so what happens is the senior leaders say, we need to fix those people down further down the organization. But of course, they're unaware of their own blind spots. And actually, the aspects of their leadership that everyone else can see that needs fixing. So all too often what you end up with is a situation where everyone's pointing fingers at everyone else. The senior leaders are pointing down the organization saying we need to develop those people. But when you speak to those and they speak where they feel psychologically safe, they're actually pointing their fingers up at the organization saying those leaders need to be fixed as well. So it has to happen at all levels, and it has to start with you. Make well-being a top priority in your organization. Embed management development and experiential learning into your business, really top to bottom. And you can really tell organizations that do this because you see learning processes embedded into the day-to-day business. Simple things like at the end of a meeting, do we take 5 minutes to review how that meeting went and what went better? Things like that. Is feedback so into the culture that you see teams regularly giving each other feedback, even when there isn't bad feedback to do. So it's really about embedding learning into everyday work. Start with yourself and lead by example, and really ultimately putting vision, meaning, and purpose at the core of everything you do. Because in today's environment, people are under more stress than ever before, and people will willingly and joyfully give much more of their effort if they can see how it fits into the nobler purpose or the bigger picture of what the business is trying to achieve. There's a famous story of President Kennedy went to visit Cape Canaveral. And when he went there, he was just touring the facility when in the hangar, this vast hangar, he sees this man in overalls sweeping the floor, but with such energy and with such high levels of engagement and drive. And he goes up to the man and he says, "What are you doing? What do you do here?" And the man says, "I'm helping to put a man on the moon." How do you help employees see the important part of the work they do and how that aligns to the bigger purpose beyond profit that your business exists is really essential to creating for the leaders to create the kind of cultures that they need to be successful moving forward. So just to come to the last slide then, please. Thank you for the time to talk today. As we said, we've called ourselves Living Systems because throughout the industrial age, we saw organizations and treated them as machines. And along the way is what happened is we've tried to engineer out emotions and relationships from the boardroom. Well, in an age of disruption, in an age where employee well-being is becoming so important, we need to recognize that organizations aren't just mechanistic structures. They're also complex living systems of people and relationships, and they have the potential, when they're properly connected, for self-organization, creativity, and resilience, which is just what's needed in today's environment. So that the winners in the 21st century will be those organizations that really recognize this and embrace this by learning to balance direction with connection. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that session, Ian. And we've got a few questions from the audience for you.
Sure.
So we're going to start with one, which is, in your experience, what is the most significant area of leadership that needs development?
It's a great question. And I was warned against my team getting too technical. So there's no technical parts in these slides, but typically when we think about development, we think about learning new skills and new attributes, new competencies. And that's what we call, or is typically called, horizontal development. If you like, it's about having an existing glass, which is your leadership capacity, and then trying to fill it to the brim with new knowledge and new learning. One of the most exciting areas of leadership development in the last 15 to 20 years has been the development of what's called vertical development. And it actually sees that as leaders, we go through steps in terms of our development throughout our lifestyle. And as individuals, we can plateau at one of those steps. So not everyone makes it to the later stages. And it's not that being at a later stage makes you a better person or makes you happier, but it does impact your ability or the mental complexity that you have, and therefore your ability to deal with complex transformation. So just a quick example of that, one of the most common levels we see issues with is the expert to achiever level. The expert level, your sense of self is still defined by your technical expertise. Whereas the achiever is your sense of self and pride and your primary values about business outputs. So very often we see that people who are recruited into managerial roles who are the expert action logic, as it's called, really struggle to move out of that environment where they don't have to be the expert all the time, where they can coach other people to actually come to solutions for themselves. So yeah, I'd definitely say for me, it's probably vertical development, presence and awareness, and anything related to self-awareness are the most important skills at the moment.
Thanks very much. Okay, next question is, how do you balance accountability with support?
It's a really great question, and the answer to that would be, I think, first of all, is to recognize it's a polarity. And what I mean by that is very often we try to come up with definitive answers, come up with policies, and try to mechanize everything that we do as if there's a right answer. And I think when you're dealing with a polarity, there's a need to recognize that you're dealing with a fundamental tension, and that there needs to be some discretion and ability to act in local circumstances depending upon what's right. So again, I think it's about balancing effective processes and direction, but recognizing you cannot embed process to sort all of that issue out. It's also balancing that with the leadership and the management capability to have a discretion in a situation about how much I need to drive and control and how much actually I need to support. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of slightly longer questions now, so I'll try and sort of distill them down. The first one is about getting physically close to colleagues in the kind of talk push way that you described. So how do we do that, given that we can't actually be physically close to people?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I don't think there's any research been done. I'd love to see it on what the somatic, in other words, the impact is on our bodies of not being able to be in the same room, because there's a lot of stuff around reverberation, resonance, energy fields. It all sounds pretty kooky, but it's actually very mainstream neuroscience at the moment of when we're in the same room. And clearly that isn't possible. One of the things that I would say is possible, though, is I think language can bring us closer. And I think how we use language, and without becoming too manipulative about this, but actually being conscious of the language we use and using language that can bring us closer. So to give you an example, in one of the programs that we ran, we brought together people from across these different action logics, these vertical development stages that I was talking about before. And what we noticed was that the experts and the earlier stage people use language very differently to more senior, later stage leaders in the room. And one of them was around what we call third, second, first person. And I'll tie this back to your question in a minute. So first person language is when I'm talking about myself. I feel nervous, I feel insecure, I feel happy, I feel confident. Second person language is when we're talking about the relationship, which is actually, I don't trust you, I do trust you, how are we doing? Is this level of pace all right? That's all second person. And then third person is talking about the business, which is numbers, stats, everything that's outside of this room. And as we started to debrief how we were talking, we realized that the later stage individuals were using much more second and first person language. Whereas the experts would literally, most of their conversation would focus on just what was outside the room or just what was theoretical. And we actually debriefed this, and the expert couldn't understand why you'd want to talk about what's going on inside you, what's happening within this relationship, until the team started to tell them that it had a huge impact on their trust and their ability to trust them. And that individual went away, tried some techniques around self-disclosure, and they found actually within 4 days that we're on this program that it just broke open all of their relationships all of a sudden. So I think one of the things that we can do, that was a very long answer, is really be conscious of the language we're using and train people to be able to use language that brings us closer. It's not a physical hand on the knee, but it's a verbal hand on the knee. So if, just typically working as a psychotherapist is if someone starts to talk about a really difficult situation and you're just sitting there very blank and not giving them anything back about how you're feeling, that could actually make them close down. If you can use language really skillfully, which is, I'm really touched by that, or wow, that sounds really difficult. I notice that I feel scared as I hear you say that. Used masterfully and used with skill, those techniques can have the same or even more of an impact than actual physical touch.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Last question then, and again, this is quite a long one, but I'll try to get across what the question is asking. So the person asks, they say, I'd rather have systems and processes in place that are black and white with no grey areas. Is there a way that you can manage or lead in black and white?
So, I mean, I have an answer and opinion to that. Is I become very nervous when we're talking black and white anything. I think it is an ideal way of running a business. It would be great if we could just implement processes and systems and just let the business work like that. But the fact of the matter is, and I think in the 20th century, it was more possible to do that because we didn't face as much disruption. So if I look at my job at Mars, it was pretty much look at what's happened back over the last 5 years, predict there forward, and put a bit extra into the hockey stick growth line that I create, and then align around that prediction based on the past. We just can't do that anymore. The organizations that are really struggling at the moment, I think, are the ones that have so many processes embedded in their systems, so many structures, there is too many systems and processes trying to control, that what tends to happen then is that it's fine for a while. So, you adjust it. Many engineering organizations we work with struggle with this. You put in place loads of processes and systems to adapt to the current market environment. But of course, then the market shifts and disrupts, and all of those processes and systems that you've over-engineered in your business are now going to keep you held back. They're going to act like a glue that stops you moving to where you want. So I think in the new environment, there has to be an element of gray, which is enough processes and systems that are fit for purpose, but also there has to be some reliance on the management and leadership capability to adapt that and to make it fit and to actually keep the organization agile and nimble enough. Otherwise, you end up in the problem which is why so many scaling businesses really struggle to adapt over time, which is that they over-engineer their processes and systems.
Okay, Ian, that was absolutely excellent. Thank you very much for that.